Get going. Just a couple of quick announcements first. Actually, I think only just one, which has to do with the waiting list. Over the weekend, we moved a bunch of people off the waiting list and into the course. So when I checked about an hour ago, there were 6 seats left. We will fill those off the waiting list, and we will give priority to psych and cog sci majors. We have to do that. We want to do that. We have to do that. So two things. Well, three things. First, go to the discussion section for which you're waitlisted if you want to try to get in the course. That's the only pathway in. If there are seats in the discussion section available, then we'll do what we can. The second thing is do that this week. Okay. The third thing is that if you're a psych or cognitive science major and you've just recently declared that major, like in the last couple of days, we have no way of knowing that. It takes Verifax somewhere between a couple of days and a couple of years to get updated. And this is especially a problem for those of you who are double majors, because if you're a double major, all it says in Verifax that I can read is double. Okay? And I don't know whether you're a double major in Danish poetry and translation and electrical engineering or what you're a double major in, right? So when you get your discussion section, make sure the GSI knows that you're a psych or a cog sci major, if that's in fact the case, okay? Because that way we know who we're dealing with. There are most seats vacant in 2 Friday sections, 108 and 109. If you get yourself on the wait list for that, you thereby greatly increase your chances of getting in the course. So that's all I have to say about that. Should I say anything else? No? Say nothing at all? Say nothing. Any further questions about organization and structure of the course? Yeah. Yeah, look, Verifax is as much a mystery to faculty as it is to students. The only way I've been able to figure this out is that once the wait list exceeds the number of seats available, then they don't accumulate the wait list any longer. But that seems to be a secret that's held closely in Sproul Hall, and I don't really completely understand it. But as I say, we will do our best to get you in the course. Okay, we want you in the course, and we'll do the best we can. At the moment, for some reason, enrollment is restricted to 206 students, and it really should be 210. We'll deal with that later. But we have to deal with fire marshals and all sorts of things that limit enrollment besides the GSI contract. Anything else? Okay, what I want to do the next couple of days for this series of lectures is to lay the foundations for one aspect of social cognition, which has to do with the cognitive mediation of social behavior. And the general idea here is that I think the best way to think about social psychology is that what social psychology is really interested in is the translation of mind into action. The behaviors that interest us as psychologists are typically social behaviors. Behavior takes place in a social context. And what's really interesting about social psychology is that it connects up what's going on in people's heads to what they do in the real world, okay? The real world of other people and behavior. And the general idea behind all of psychology is what's known as the doctrine of mentalism, or sometimes called the doctrine of mental causation, which basically says that the way we think and feel and desire, what we think, what we feel, what we desire, determines what we're going to do. That mental states stand in relation to action as cause is to effect. And it follows from that if you want to understand what a person does in a particular situation, what you have to do is to understand how or she perceives that situation, what his or her beliefs and expectations and all sorts of other things are. And that's what we mean by the cognitive mediation of social interaction. You have to understand the situation from the subject's point of view, a phrase that you'll hear me repeat over and over. The deep sources of this idea comes from a psychologist who emigrated to the United States from Europe in the wake of Hitler's machinations, Kurt Lewin, a very famous social psychologist, who articulated beginning in the 30s what has come to be known sometimes as Lewin's grand truism. And Lewin loved mathematics, and he especially loved pseudo-mathematics, and he expressed this grand truism in this following piece of pseudo-mathematics: B is a function of P and E, okay? Where behavior, B refers to behavior, P refers to all the factors, all the causal factors that are internal to the person, and E refers to all the causal factors that reside in the environment outside the person. Now, it's called Lewin's grand truism because if you think about it for about 500 milliseconds, there isn't anything else, okay? There's just behavior, and there's people, and there's the environment, right? There isn't anything else. But it turns out that Lewin's grand truism was also quite profound and has served as a kind of organizing principle for social psychology for pretty much ever since. And in particular, this idea that behavior is a function of the person and the environment gave rise to what I like to think of as two cultures within psychology: a culture of personality psychology and a culture of social psychology. Traditional personality psychology emphasizes P, emphasizes behavior as a function of the person. And you'll remember from your introductory social psychology class, if you haven't had anything else, that traditional personality psychologists think about people in terms of their traits like extroversion, their attitudes like, liberalism, their emotions, their moods, their drives, their values, whether they think personal freedom is more important than personal choice or whatever. And the general idea is that personality psychologists try to assess these internal states, these traits and states and motives and desires, and then correlate them with what people do in the actual world. What traditional personality psychology does then is to consider those environmental factors as kind of noise to be averaged out or averaged over in order to get at that part of the causal chain that is intrinsic to the person. Social psychologists, by contrast, traditional social psychologists have tended to focus on behavior as a function of the environment. They look at the physical environment, how hot it is, how humid it is, how crowded it is. They look at the social environment, how many people there are, what they're doing, what they're saying, and then look at the individual's behavior as a function of those kinds of things. Whereas traditional personality psychologists preferred correlational methods, traditional social psychologists prefer experimental methods in which you manipulate some independent variable, like some feature of the social environment, and then observe the effect of that experimental manipulation on some dependent variable, chiefly what the person does or says in that environment. And in the same way, the traditional personality psychologists thought of the environment as noise that you want to average out in order to reveal the causal role of personal factors. Social psychologists tend to think of persons as noise that you want to average out or average over in order to reveal the causal impact of environmental factors. And what happened over the years is that personality and social psychology gradually began to diverge into two separate disciplines of psychology. If you remember your introductory textbook, personality and social psychology were treated in 2 different chapters, or maybe 3 or 4 different chapters, but different chapters. Not here at Berkeley, because we know better, but there are lots of departments where personality and social psychology are different fields of graduate study. Okay? At the University of Michigan, until recently, the personality and social psychologists were housed in different buildings on the campus. They just didn't have any interaction with each other. They became these, what C.P. Snow would have called 2 cultures. Yes?
Are there any asocial environmental factors?
Oh yeah, there are lots of asocial environmental factors. I listed a couple just a couple minutes ago. Humidity, temperature, crowding. You can think of that as just like restriction on personal space. Those aren't social factors in the usual sense. They're features of a physical environment. So yeah, you have things like that. And it turns out social psychologists often study the effects of these on behavior. Environmental psychology very much comes out of social psychology. But they're not expressly social kinds of features. Yes?
What would like biological states, like if I'm blind or missing an arm, what part of that?
Well, that would be part of you. So the fact that you have some disability, for example, would be a feature of you as a person that constrains what you can do, or how you think about yourself, or how you relate to other people. So everything that's internal to you, both your physical traits, if you will, and your psychological traits, that's all what Lewin thought of as the person. Now, just to get ahead of myself a little bit, we're going to break this down later, okay? Because Lewin was smarter than that. He was smarter than the traditional personality psychologist. He was smarter than the traditional social psychologist. But it's taken us a while to catch up to him. Okay, now what's happened, let's just focus on social psychology for a moment. So what happened is that people began to think about the personal determinants of behavior and the environmental determinants of behavior as acting separately and independently. You've got a causal chain between the person and the environment, whatever its features are. You've got a causal chain that's studied by traditional personality psychology. You've got a causal chain between the environment and the behavior that takes place in that environment, and that's studied by traditional social psychology, and that's basically the way all of that goes. Especially this social psychological influence of the environment on behavior meshed with another strong trend in psychology known as the behaviorist revolution, initiated by John B. Watson in the late teens and early 20s. Before that, before the behaviorist revolution, psychology was really expressly was in fact concerned with mental states. Think about how William James defined psychology as the science of mental life. Think about the early psychophysicists who were interested in sensory experience. Watson thought that psychology would never make any progress so long as it focused on people's subjective mental states, for the simple reason that they were subjective. And in a science, you've got to be dealing with publicly observable things that you can verify publicly. So what Watson did in the late teens and early 20s of the 20th century, he argued that we should have a complete rethinking of what psychology is all about, involving these basic principles. The first is that humans are behaving organisms, okay? And what psychology should be studying is not mental life. Psychology should be studying behavior. That's where the behaviorist revolution gets its name. Behavior and the conditions under which it occurs, things that can be objectively measured, objectively quantified. How many times do I engage in some motor action? What are the circumstances under which I do that? But Watson went further than that to deny the fundamental principle of psychology up to that time, which was that he denied that mental states were causally efficacious. It doesn't matter what you're thinking, you know, we can just ignore that. All that matters is what you do and the environment in which you do it in. Behaving organisms, and that includes humans and rats and chimpanzees and dogs and cats, simply react to environmental stimuli. All the causal power resides in the environment. He said, look, this is the only way for psychology to advance as a natural science. We can focus on observable variables to allow us to predict behavior, check our theories and make them better, and also to control behavior in order to improve to improve the human condition. Early on, traditional social psychology, with its emphasis of the impact of the environment on behavior, engaged in a kind of unholy alliance with behaviorism. And this is very early on. This is Floyd Allport. There are two Allports in psychology. They were brothers. This is the older brother, Floyd, who as early as 1924 embraced Watson's doctrine of behaviorism and began to cast social psychology exclusively as a psychology of environmental influence. He said, look, there's just two things that go on when it comes to social behavior. The first of this is that there's behavior which occurs in response to the stimulus of another person's behavior, and then there's behavior which serves as a stimulus to another person's response. You can't get any clearer example of stimulus response behaviorism than this early formulation of social psychology by Floyd Allport. So he goes on and says, well, what's personality? Well, personality is just the individual's characteristic response to stimulus. Okay, that's all personality is. And attitudes, the chief construct in social psychology at the time, are simply preparations for response by the neuromuscular system. Again, all stimulus response language. And finally, here's so much for social psychology, all behavior phenomena of groups are reducible to mechanisms of individual behavior in the social environment. The whole group behavior is precisely the sum of its parts, the sum of the individual behaving organisms in it. This already, just 5 years after Watson writes psychology from the standpoint of behaviors, this is being embraced totally by one of the earliest social psychologists. Floyd Allport, in fact, wrote the first textbook on social psychology. Yeah.
Were they saying more like maybe people just don't even think? Or
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying. I think they might not have gone quite that far in their public rhetoric, but you don't have to pay attention to what people think. All you have to pay attention to is what people do and the environment in which they do it. Everything else doesn't matter.
Yeah, was it more like I'm looking at person's actions, not what they're saying, type of thing? Or they literally just thought people don't think, or it's totally relevant?
Well, they're literally saying people don't think, right? Let's put it this way. You only think you think, okay? Or maybe put it slightly differently. You only think your thoughts matter. They really don't. All that really matters is what's going on in the environment outside the individual. So social psychology very quickly emerged as a kind of functional behaviorism, where social psychologists began to measure some feature of the environment, measure some feature of the individual's behavior, and then began to associate the two of them. So equating control by the environment with control of the stimulus, that's basic behaviorism. And then they began to think, well, okay, well, it turns out that people differ in their behavior, so how are we supposed to think about that? Well, they have a way of thinking about that. The first way is that there are individual differences, never mind in personality traits, like neuroticism or extroversion or something like that. You have differences in reinforcement history, what you've gotten rewarded and punished for in the past. That determines what your the variability in behavior. Or whatever conditioned stimuli happen to be present in the environment at a particular time, or whatever discriminative stimuli happen to be present in the environment at a particular time. All the action resides in the environment. None of the action resides in the individual. It's the situation that controls behavior, and it's the situation that we're going to make science out of. B.F. Skinner, Watson's great disciple, I'll put it very nicely. You want to see what this is all about? The free inner man who is held responsible for the behavior of the external biological organism is only a pre-scientific substitute for the kinds of causes which are discovered in the course of a scientific analysis. The kinds of causes that are discovered in the course of a scientific analysis, all these alternative causes lie outside the individual. That is as clear a statement of the doctrine of situationism as you can want to have. And it looks like this. First, as Skinner said, the important causal factors in behavior are external to the person. They reside in the environment somehow. And then there's kind of a corollary to this, which says that there isn't any mediation between the stimulus and the response. The stimuli control responses directly. All you have to do is to know what eliciting stimuli are present in the environment, what discriminative stimuli are present in the environment, and the individual's reinforcement history, what's happened to the individual in the past, and that's really all you need to know. Okay, now Skinner spent his career running pigeons, right? He wasn't a social psychologist in any sense, though he did think of himself as a social philosopher. But Floyd Allport's little brother, Gordon, one of the most famous social psychologists of the 20th century, picked up on this very nicely when he classically defined social psychology as the psychology of social influence. With few exceptions, social psychologists regard their discipline as an attempt to understand and explain how the thought, feeling, and behavior of individuals are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of other human beings. In other words, social psychology is defined hereby as a psychology of environmental influence, how what's going on in the world outside you affects what you do or think or feel. Now notice that he's not a complete behaviorist. Allport and Skinner were in the same department, but they didn't have very much contact with each other, and in fact, there was a point where the division that Allport was in didn't share an elevator with the division that Skinner was in. The elevators actually stopped at different floors, so they wouldn't have to interact with each other. But the fact of the matter is that here you do have Allport talking about thoughts and feelings as well as behavior. But Skinner, and a radical behaviorist, is not going to have any of it, and we'll see in a minute how this worked its way into social psychology as well. Yes? Well, if you remember the learning chapter of your introductory psychology textbook, that there are all sorts of cues to behavior. And when you condition a rat or a pigeon or whatever, one of the things you do is you might put a discriminative stimulus in there in the environment to tell it when a particular behavior is going to be reinforced. That's what a discriminative stimulus is. It's really just another stimulus, another thing that's outside the environment. Okay, so what happens here, by 1954, from 1924 to 1954, social psychology gradually gets defined as the psychology of social influence and begins to embrace a kind of crypto behaviorism that focuses on the environment and not so much on what the person is thinking or feeling. You can still see this today. Here is a quotation from Matt Lieberman at UCLA, a very distinguished young cognitive social neuroscientist, in fact, who, if a social psychologist was going to be marooned on a deserted island and could take only one principle with him, it would undoubtedly be the power of the situation, right? All the most classic studies in the early days of social psychology demonstrated that situations can exert a powerful force over the actions of individuals. And as a kind of corollary to this, Lieberman argued not for a second principle of what he called situation blindness. First, the situation is inordinately powerful in terms of controlling our behavior, and second, we don't know that. Okay? If the power of the situation is the first principle of social psychology, a second is that people are largely unaware of the influence of situations on behavior, whether it is their own or someone else's behavior. Between Skinner, Gordon Allport, and these kinds of quotes, that is how traditional social psychology has been formulated. And it's expressed very nicely in one of the most famous experiments in all of psychology, known as the Milgram experiment, which you all know about, I know, so I won't rehearse it here, except to remind you what actually went on. Milgram recruited subjects for what he presented as a study of learning and memory and learning. And people would come into the laboratory, they'd find another person coming into the laboratory as well. There was a little bit of a little ruse in which one of these subjects was randomly assigned to the role of teacher, and the other subject was randomly assigned to the role of the learner. That's the way it was presented to the subject. But of course, one of the subjects was not a subject at all. It was a confederate of the experimenter, and he was always assigned to the learner role. And then the subject assigned to the teacher role was asked to carry out an experiment on paired associate learning, where he'd present two words to a subject and give them one as a cue, ask to remember the other. If the subject didn't remember the response correctly, then it was the job of the teacher to punish the learner for making the mistake by delivering increasingly strong electrical shocks across the course of the experiment. Initially, the electric shocks were very weak, and they got stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger every time the learner made a mistake, so that they were labeled as quite severe afterwards. Nobody's getting shocked in this experiment, of course, but the learner, following the script, fakes the stress, and if the teacher begins to balk at this procedure, there's a guy in a white coat standing in the background who says, the experiment requires you to continue, you must go on, okay? And what Milgram discovered, this is from his 1963 paper, was that everybody went on, right? At low levels of shock, there was 100% compliance. This is a shock machine. Only when you got up to very high levels of shock was there any kind of fall off in compliance at all. But even at the very highest level of shock, a level of shock that went beyond danger, severe shock, to XXX, which meant something quite different in those days. Still, 65% of the subjects are complying with this thing. On the basis of experiments like this, and this is exactly what the experiment looked like, Milgram made an argument for situational control of obedient behavior. Situational control of obedient behavior. First, he said, we're impressed by the sheer strength of obedient tendencies manifested in this situation. But then he went on to summarize the kinds of situational factors that seem to influence obedience. Whether there was an authority figure present, how close the teacher was to the learner, how close the authority figure was to the teacher, and whether you ran the experiment in the collegiate Gothic confines of Yale University or a rundown warehouse in Bridgeport.